Hello and welcome to a comparison video of the three main carriers used by the Rebellion, the Black Sun, and the Empire. This list includes the Quasar Fire Escort Carrier, the Tonfolk Escort Carrier, and the Captor Carrier. This comparison video will include 11 total categories going over the strengths and weaknesses of each ship, with each ship either getting a 3-point, a 2-point, or a 1-point ranking based off the category. At the end, we will add up all of the points and decide which is best based on all of the categories. Keep in mind that even though this video is going to declare a loser, it does not mean that that ship is unusable, and most of these come down to my own personal opinion. Also, this video will not include any gameplay of the ships, but if you want to see a detailed ship showcase of each ship, they will be linked in the end screen of the video. Our first category will be the prices of each ship. Also, one more thing to note about the carriers is the Quasar has 2 variants, the Tonfolk has 4 variants, and the Captor has 3 variants. That will be slightly adjusted in a few of these categories when it comes to their actual fighter loadouts. But the pricing category, we have the 2 prices for the Quasar. They're pretty cheap. You got the upgraded Quasar as very cheap. It is much cheaper than the upgraded variants of the other 2 carriers. And its actual original price is also pretty cheap, so it will receive 3 points. I gave the Tonfolk the worst ranking as its highest 2 carrier variants are 2 very expensive. Even though the Captor does have the most expensive variants, it doesn't compare to 2 extremely expensive variants. So 2 points for the Captor and 1 point for the Tonfolk. Our next category is the survivability of each of the carriers. So we have their armor, what type of armor it is, what type of shields it is, and how effective those shields are. So for the Quasar, we have the average charging balanced shields with a strength of 2000 and light armor with a strength of 1500. That is by far the worst of the 3 ships. And the second best is the Tonfolk, as it has the same shields, however has 15, double the amount of armor as the Quasar. But neither of these quite come anywhere near the Captor. The Captor has some very impressive armor, at least in comparison to the other 2 carriers. It has slow charging balanced shields with a strength of 2500 and medium armor with a strength of 5000. So the survivability of the Captor almost earned it 4 points just because of how much better it is in comparison to the other ships. The next category is the movement of each ship. We have acceleration of average and a turn of average with a speed of 200 for the Quasar versus the speed of 250 and an acceleration of low and a turn of low. When it came to what I found more valuable, either the acceleration of average and average or the straight line 50 more speed, I gave it to the average of the acceleration and turn. I think the maneuverability of the Quasar carrier is a little bit more valuable than the straight line speed of the Captor. But the Captor will get second place as worse speed and worse acceleration and turn will only get the Tonfolk 1 point. The next category is the ranges. The ranges aren't too important. The most important range is probably the sensor range when it comes to the carriers. So I gave the highest sensor range of 3000 3 points, and then I gave this Captor carrier 2 points because it has impressive sensor range that is better than the Tonfolk. So ranges, like I said, not too important. Moving on to the weapons. The weapons on a carrier are a little bit more valuable than people probably think. Carriers oftentimes are involved in the battle a lot more than people think. People usually kind of think that, oh, carriers are way outside of the battlefield. They're stuck on the back lines. They're not really all that useful. But when it comes to the Captor's weapons, 1 light quad turbo laser, 4 heavy laser cannons, and 6 laser cannons. That's pretty impressive. That can take on a frigate and beat a frigate. It could also easily take on some corvettes and take out a corvette pretty well. Surprisingly good weapons, combined with the survivability of the ship, the Captor can take on some decently sized ships. I gave the Tonfolk 2 points as I think the 6 dual flak laser cannons are better than 4 non-dual flak laser cannons, and the 2 heavy laser cannons aren't too important. Our next category is the pop cap, obviously a little bit slightly different because of the variants. However, 14 for the Tonfolk is very, very impressive, especially since you're going to be using that specific variant a lot, and 17 is tied with this. The Captor does have some bad pop caps, so it will only receive 1 point, and in between the two is the Quasar at 2 points. Now we have our 4 categories of the actual loadouts. Like I said, the Quasar only has 2 variants, so we had to reuse these twice, and we had to reuse one of these once as well. But for the fighter loadout, what I just call the base fighter loadout, we have 2 X-Wing squadrons with 4 in reserve, and 1 U-Wing squadron, going up against 2x6 TIE Fighter squadrons and 1x1 TIE Bomber squadron, going up against 2x4 Z95 squadrons and 1 cloak-shaped squadron with 2 in reserve. What do I find more valuable? X-Wing squadrons are by far the best fighter in this entire group, plus it has the U-Wing squadron in reserve, I mean not in reserve, but to help it out, to add that supplement drop ability. So the combination of these 3 squadrons is very, very effective. I gave the 2 points to the Z95s and the cloak shapes. Z95's squadrons versus a TIE Fighter squadron is a pretty even match. However, cloak shaped squadrons are very, very good with their barrage missiles, and TIE bombers don't really fit into the fighter loadout. So the Tonfolk, as good as it is, as well as it does have 2 extra squadrons in reserve, is not quite as good when it comes to the actual combat of the fighter squadrons. Moving on to our strike fighter loadouts, we once again are using the 2x4 X-Wing squadrons and the 1 U-Wing squadron, going up against the strike fighter squadrons of the Tonfolk, which will include 2x6 TIE Interceptor squadrons and a TIE Punisher. Basically, Interceptors are a little bit better than fighters, and Punishers are a lot better than bombers. And then the strike fighter for the Captor carriers are 2x4 R41 squadrons and 1x2 ARC 170s. I really don't like the strike variants of the Captor. I think the strike variant of the Captor is actually the worst out of all, 9 total variants of all the carriers. I think that it is just purely the worst. I don't like R41s. They do a lot of ion weapon damage, but ion weapon damage against fighters is not really all that useful. And ARC 170s are pretty good scouts, but nobody really needs scouts when you're trying to win fighter battles. So over here we have 2 points. TIE Interceptor squadrons versus an X-Wing squadron still isn't going to win that fight. And we also have the U-Wing squadron to help out in that fight as well. It is definitely nice to have the extra 2 fighter squadrons, but I still don't think that they're quite as good as the X-Wings. Moving on to the advanced fighter loadout, for the Quasar Fire Escort Carrier, we have 1x2 A-Wing Flight, 1x2 B-Wing Flight, 1x2 X-Wing Flight, and 1 X-4 Gunship Squadron. Keep in mind that flights are half of the size of a squadron, so they're not nearly as good as squadrons, as they are only half of the size. The advanced fighter loadout for the Tonfolk is 2x6 TIE Interceptor squadrons and 1x1 TIE Avenger squadrons. Avenger squadrons are pretty good. They're still probably not quite as good as A-Wing squadrons, however that is an A-Wing flight. So 1 TIE Avenger squadron versus 1 A-Wing flight, I'm going to give the edge to the TIE Avenger. So the Tonfolk is going to get 3 points. The advanced fighter loadout for the Quasar is going to get 2 points, and 1 point for the Captor. We had to reuse the Z95 squadrons and the Cloak Shape, which aren't going to keep up with the flights over here. 1 X-4 Gunship Squadron is also very good, because they're extremely hard to kill. However, you also get 2 extra in reserve for the TIE Interceptors once again on the Tonfolk, which makes it even better. The Bomber loadout, once again, is that same loadout for the Quasars. You got your B-Wing Squadron, or your B-Wing Flight, actually. B-Wing Flights are very, very good. They're definitely the bomber of this group, but A-Wings aren't anywhere near bombers, and X-4s are also not bombers. X-Wings do have their light proton torpedoes, so they're technically bombers, but they're really not all that effective. They're more better at fighter duties. I said duty. Alright, sorry. Alright, XG-1 Star Wings are effective, however they're not really bombers. They're really considered to be heavy fighters. Same with the TIE Brutes. Yes, they're bombers technically, but they're more or less heavy fighters. And then you got your TIE Punishers, which are definitely bombers. They are an effective bomber squadron. Over here for the Captor carrier, however, you got your super squadrons with their bullets, not lasers, bullets, which act as bombers, and then you got your free fall squadrons, which are so good. My favorite all-time clip when recording Awakening of the Rebellion is in my free fall squadron battle, ship showcase battle. It was like 10 squadrons of free falls. They're going up against a Venator. One run of 10 free fall squadrons killed an entire Venator. Gotta be my favorite clip. I highly recommend you check out that video just to see that clip. 2 points basically going to the TIE Punisher squadrons, because 1x3 is better than 1x2 B-Wing flights. And 1 point for those guys as well. Our final category is the personal opinion. The Quasars are unnecessary, as well as they have a poor price ratio. Let me explain. They're unnecessary because when it comes to all of these different things, you can buy all of these on their own. You can buy X-Wings on your own, you can buy U-Wings by themselves, you can buy A-Wings, B-Wings, X-Wings, and X-4 gunships all on their own for a much cheaper price than what the Quasar cost. So most of you are probably like, Captain, the Quasars have a much higher survivability of the fighters, and I agree. However, the Quasars still do die occasionally, and you're spending 6,000 on a Quasar rather than 500 on an individual squadron. So I still think that they're not quite as good, as well as when you're using these Quasars, this different variants, they're not quite as good. They're only providing flights instead of squadrons, which is what you buy individual. So I prefer to buy squadrons straight up rather than the Quasars when it comes to the Rebellion. Even though, when I think about it, my Rebellion campaign, I actually have 1 fleet of Quasars and 1 fleet of buying the actual ships. My personal opinion for the Tonfolk carrier is that they still don't keep up when it comes to fighter battles. When you're fighting against the Rebellion, even if you were to have 3 Tonfolks on the battlefield, they still don't provide enough fighters to actually win the fighter battles against the Rebellion. So I still don't think they keep up, and they get outdone by Raiders. Raider Corvettes by the Empire, once you're at Tech 3, I highly recommend using Raiders. They have a little bit of a better survivability than the actual fighter squadrons, and they can take out X-Wing squadrons pretty good over time. So 2 points, I still do think Tonfolks are a little bit more necessary than the Quasars. My personal opinion of the Captor is that they're the best carrier. Not the best hangar bay necessarily, but the best carrier. Great survivability, solid weapons, that's what makes them the best carrier. You can have the Captor carrier in the fights, and it will be able to hold its own. It is also the most practical. You can really use the bomber support as well as the fighter support, because you don't really have very many other carriers that are bringing fighters to the battlefield. So 3 points for the Captor carrier. Unleashing our final scores, 23 points for the Quasar, 20 points for the Tonfolk, and 23 points for the Captor carrier. Of course we can't have a tie, so I gave the Tonfolk 2 extra points because it has 4 variants rather than the 2 variants, and I gave the Captor 1 extra point for having 3 variants, so the winner is the Captor carrier. I really like how they have 3 different versions of the Captors, even though one of them is completely useless, and 2 extra variants of the Tonfolk. Perhaps in the future we'll see a 3rd or a 4th Quasar carrier, but until then we have not seen it. So my winner is the Captor carrier. I highly recommend you invest into some Captor carriers if you're playing as the Black Sun. I don't think the Quasars are quite as necessary, and Tonfolks are very good until you get Tech 3 and unlock those Raiders.